Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. The United States on Friday sanctioned the US assets of Georgian billionaire Bidzina Ivanishvili, a former prime minister widely seen as the country's de facto leader. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Ivanishvili had implemented, quote, actions or policies that undermine democratic processes or institutions in the United States or abroad for Russia. Meanwhile, in the Baltic Sea, an oil tanker has been detained over suspected sabotage for Russia, according to a report by shipping website Lloyd's List. How much longer can Putin afford to cause mischief on so many fronts while carrying on a full-scale war and facing multiple sanctions? Well, to explore this and related questions, we're joined by Joshua Burgin, NSL Program Coordinator, Warsaw Security Forum, and a regular guest on TVP World. Joshua, welcome back. Good to see you.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure as always. Now, you know, Russia's kind of being particularly mischievous, isn't it, on a number of fronts. It's spending all this money on the war in Ukraine. It's investing on influencing countries like, of course, Georgia, Moldova, in the elections, and so on. Now, can it afford to do this? I mean, its revenues are reducing. How's it managing, and is it sustainable?
Obviously, there's increasing pressure on the Russian economy. It looks as though Vladimir Putin has jumped the shark. He is deep into a situation he can hardly back out of, and I don't see it getting better before it gets worse. That said, it might need to get worse in order for things to get better, as part of his elites in Russia come to terms with the fact that this is an unwinnable situation for them. And probably as importantly, as Western governments wake up to the fact that this is not mischief. I kind of liked your play on words there. I think mischief is a very delicate way to describe it. It's aggressive. It's full on war with the West. He's been talking about this for a while, and now he's implementing. And it's long past time for Western leaders to wake up, stop playing patty cake, and get serious.
Okay, fair enough, understood. Now, you mention the elites in Russia. Now, they've been, thus far at least, seeming to support his actions. Do you think there's a chance that they might change their attitude if this continues much longer?
Well, I certainly think that if the Western world were as in lockstep as Russian elites tend to be, visibly. Again, what we don't see behind the scenes, we don't see. But if the Western world was is in lockstep as Russian elites were, I think this war would have come to an end a long time ago. That said, I think it's incredibly important for the West generally to lock arms and to hold Russia accountable. You've already touched on it. I don't mean to jump ahead of you. The fact that Sweden has impounded that ship is a good first start. The notion that Russia has now multiple times inflicted damage on infrastructure in the Baltic Sea, the first time with little to no consequence, this can't stand if Russia's to be held accountable.
Right, so slowly but surely it looks as though the West is starting to act in unison. Now, what's the West going to do about Georgia? I mean, we've been hearing of protests, against the election results, and it seems to have done an about-face. Georgian dream is turning out to be more of a Georgian nightmare. What's going on, and how is Russia influencing that situation?
You know, for those of us who've been observing Georgia for a while now, the Georgian dream was predictably that nightmare that you've touched on. And it's not just recently. It's been going back now for 5 or 6 years, even from the point that it started. If we look at the Bidzina Ivanishvili, as you've already mentioned tonight in the program, the man is worth somewhere between $5 and $8 billion, something on the order of 25% of the Georgian GDP. And I've looked, and I can't see any comparable member of the Georgian society that has anywhere near that level of wealth. To that end, I think it's long past time for the United States to sanction him. I think I believe it's past time for the Georgians themselves to stop protesting at the parliament. I understand there's a long tradition there, but I also understand that Ivanishvili has a large industrial-looking house on the side of the hill overlooking the city. That's the point for protest, in my view.
Understood. Now, okay, so I think it's fairly generally accepted that Russia is behind this. It's moving in the background to keep Georgia away, or certainly the political classes away from the West. What is Russia so concerned about?
Well, Russia's classically wanted to have border states that protect it from anything outside of that area. No thought being given to what the publics or the societies in those countries, how they wish to live, how they wish to be ruled. And it's obvious that many people in Georgia, just like many people in Ukraine, would much rather have to work under the rules of law, et cetera, that exist in the EU and in the West generally, versus having the thumb of Moscow always hanging over their head. This said, clearly Russia has been manipulating Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine for a long time now. And the notion of bringing the borders into question was about damaging or diminishing those nation states' abilities to progress forward, either with EU relationships, NATO membership, et cetera, et cetera. There's always controversy around future NATO membership, but at the end of the day, we must remember that the people living in those countries would far rather be under the rules and the guidelines and the structured order of the Western world rather than the chaos and the sort of upward flow of power and money to the mafia-led state of Moscow. I don't like that term. I think it's overused in certain cases, but we see a strong man who has a very small clutch of people around him that are effectively enriching themselves off of the backs of everybody else in their downline, be that the Russian citizens themselves, neighboring states like Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, certainly countries like Kazakhstan should be concerned about when and if the Russian boot comes down on them. And, you can only imagine that people living in these societies would rather live normal lives rather than the chaotic and disruptive lives created by Russia.
Certainly, that would seem to be the case in Georgia with the protests that have been going on for so many days now. Now, the thing is, of course, the thing that triggered those protests was the pulling back by the Georgian government from EU accession talks. But the EU has not shown a great deal of enthusiasm for bringing Georgia into the fold, has it? And is there something more that the EU could do on that front?
Well, to this point, perhaps the EU has not been ready to open their doors wide to Georgian membership. But there's always partnership agreements and abilities to sort of take a step-by-step approach before a formal sort of participation within the EU would ever happen. To your point, I would disagree slightly in the sense that these protests were not activated by Ivanishvili's choice to abandon EU efforts. Ironically, just like what happened in Ukraine. But in fact, those protests began under a flawed election that had been universally described as flawed. The OSCE, the IRI Election Observation Mission, others have clearly pointed out to systemic flaws, corruption, ballot stuffing, etc. That was all about making sure that the status quo that stood with Moscow over the Western world, the rest of the world, and the people of Georgia came to bear or became the reality. We're seeing an obvious tug of war there. And frankly, where the EU, I think, could be much more helpful is in political statements. The president of Georgia is proactive. You've just seen her on the screen there. She's working to rally her people and stand with the rights for freedom. I won't say democracy in this case, but democratic norms and freedom in that society. And frankly, the appearance of European leaders. Again, many of them right now are troubled, meaning they don't necessarily have great standing within their countries itself, but the notion of a Olaf Scholz going there, or Macron, others to go and stand in solidarity with Georgian leadership, the opposition leadership, I think goes a long way. Doesn't necessarily require formal documents, but it's the ability to express political will to support those who are seeking freedom.
Right. What about the political will from NATO to get Georgia on board?
Again, in the same way, NATO leadership could easily show up. It doesn't mean you have to sign formal documents and sort of immediately make them members of NATO. But the notion of NATO leadership showing up and being visible in the activities, that this is no longer a political campaign. The campaigns are over. We know they're flawed. Standing with people in their desire for freedom is no longer politics. This is a matter of doing what's right.
Right.
Again, I understand why nation states and even political leadership wouldn't want to necessarily go in the midst of an election, but an election that's demonstrably flawed, it makes sense for that political leadership around Europe and North America to show up en masse, maybe not at the same time, or perhaps in a coordinated way. A strong statement would be if 10 to 15 figureheads from democratic states in Western Europe and North America showed up all at once to stand with the opposition. That sends a strong signal to Moscow.
Right. Okay. Well, we should be watching closely and perhaps even see an election carried out, a second election carried out, which is not as flawed as the last one was. Just in the last couple of minutes that we have, Joshua, I'd like to get your view on the Russian-controlled ships, which have been cutting undersea cables in the Baltic Sea, and which have been found to include spy equipment. I mean, surely this is something that NATO and the Baltic countries should have anticipated, isn't it?
Well, certainly after the first incident, I would imagine that escalated attention would have come up. And in fact, I think we can see to some extent that is true. Sweden immediately boarded that ship, impounded that ship, is conducting an investigation. Russia is clearly trying to play the lines, those blurred gray lines of just short of war, creating the notion of plausible deniability, denying. This is classic Soviet KGB-styled provocation, with the knowledge that the West generally tends to not be willing to play quite so dirty a game. I'm of the view that perhaps we should question some of our reluctance to engage in almost pirateering. Russia's assets around the world are vulnerable, as are certainly ours in certain cases, and the notion that there should be absolute costs every single time they engage in these sorts of activities, it should not be a question. It should be a question of how hard will it be when they come back at us. And Russia doesn't currently have that because the West has behaved over the past 20 years as though incidents like this, even at lower scale and lower cost, were just a cost of doing business. Frankly, I think some of the Western leadership in Europe continues to hold on to the notion that they will one day return to doing business with Russia as it always was. And I think this is also a flawed and undermining perspective that is never going to come to pass, at least under the current regime.
Well, so it would seem, Joshua. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with our audience. Have a wonderful day and a Happy New Year to you.
Always a pleasure to be with you, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye now. And that's all from us in this episode of World Talks. Goodbye for now.